Oh, this is a quick overview of a playlist, which quickly overviews the human cardiovascular system. The cardiovascular system is one of the first systems of the body to work in an embryo, even when it's only a few millimeters in size. The heart is pumping blood, even though most other parts of the body have not yet begun to work. That's because you needed to accomplish three functions. First, you have to transport stuff. All right, so gases are coming in from one place, nutrients are coming in from one place, hormones may be produced in one place, and they have to be distributed throughout the body. Waste have to be transported to specific sites, etc. The environment of cells has to be regulated. So pH, heat, ion distribution, etc. These must remain constant. And then also the blood has things which protect us from, say, the loss of fluid and clotting mechanisms. And in white blood cells, which protect against infection. And so therefore, there's a number of aspects which are essential in a cardiovascular system. When it comes to blood, if blood were spun down, you would realize that there is this plasma portion, which makes up more than half of blood, which is primarily water, but has a number of important proteins in it. And then there are also then a cellular portion. Now, these cells must be continually renewed. And so in the red bone marrow, we have stem cells which respond to hormones. So for example, if the hormone erythropoietin is produced, then these stem cells in the bone marrow, they undergo a series of changes which result in the formation of a red blood cell. However, if other hormones are made, so there are these local hormones known as cytokines, these could cause these same um, stem cells in the bone marrow to become diverse white blood cells, and we have diverse white blood cells. And then the hormone thrombopoietin can result in the formation of platelets. And so the cellular portion of blood is continually renewed from populations in the bone marrow. Red blood cells, these make up more than 99% of the formed elements of blood and are the most common cell type in your body, perhaps representing a quarter of the cells in your body. So notice there's a white blood cell, here are two platelets, but virtually everything that you see in circulation are these red blood cells. In mammals, when red blood cells are formed, their nuclei are ejected. And so you don't see the dark staining nuclei that you see elsewhere. And I'm sorry, as say in the red blood cells of reptiles or amphibians or fish. Even the red blood cells of human embryos have nuclei. Um, but once these nuclei are ejected, this gives them a biconcave shape. This increases their surface area, which is good because this is now more surface area for the transport of gases. Oxygen can diffuse in and out of these cells, as can carbon dioxide. And red blood cells are full of the protein hemoglobin, which can help transport both oxygen and carbon dioxide. There are a variety of types of white blood cells, and this is because there are a variety of different types of threats against the body. There are bacteria, there are viruses, there are worms, and so there are a variety of different kinds of white blood cells, each specializing in different parts of immunity. Neutrophils, for example, are very good at fighting bacteria. Eosinophils are very good at fighting worms. Basophils, they're granules. They induce inflammation. Macrophages are big cells, which are good at fighting big things like eukaryotic cells, yeast, etc. And lymphocytes are extremely complex. There are different kinds, but they combat viruses, they can combat cancer, they produce antibodies against diverse sources. And so white blood cells are very important in protecting the body from infectious elements. White blood cells are smarter than red blood cells. They still have their nuclei. Therefore, they can choose where they exit blood vessels so that they can move towards sites of infection. So they have this ability to undergo what's called chemotaxis, to move towards certain chemicals, and then also to exit blood cells or blood vessels at specific sites to go to sites of infection. Um, they can perform phagocytosis just as could more primitive protist cells, just like paramecian amoeba can feed on bacteria, so too can white blood cells, binding to microbes using specific receptors, then surrounding them with these false feet or pseudopods, um, and then forming an internal membrane vesicle. Once they have the microbe inside, then these lysosomes, these internal membrane bags, can fuse with their digestive enzymes in an acidic juice, which can then break down the microbe. White blood cells can also perform other functions, such as promoting inflammation, even inducing fever. Platelets are the last formed element of blood. They're not really cells per se, because there are giant cells in the bone marrow called metamegakaryocytes, which under the influence of thrombopoietin then break into maybe 1,500 pieces. Each one of these fragments then is a platelet. So platelets aren't really cells, but fragments of a much larger bone marrow cell. So this is how platelets are formed. Now, mammal platelets form like this. In more primitive vertebrates, thrombocytes are individual cells rather than fragments of this bone marrow cell. I'm sorry, this is that a video which I just kind of described, that white blood cells can do two things that red blood cells can't. That while the red blood cells are just moving right along, the white blood cells can react to these green inflammatory signals. And so when there's signals of an infection, white blood cells can actually then leave the blood vessel. That's what's known as emigration, and move towards these inflammatory signals. That's what's known as chemotaxis. So white blood cells have abilities that the red blood cells lack. Um, the platelets, their main function is to help stop wounds or to plug holes once we break them. Since we are mostly fluid, obviously, if we spring a leak, this is potentially dangerous to us. And so platelets have vesicles inside of clotting factors, and the clotting factors can then help activate proteins which are already in your blood. The liver puts a lot of clotting factors in your blood in an inactive state. And so then what gets activated is what's called a clotting factor cascade, where one clotting factor activates the next, and then finally, then there are proteins known as fibrinogen in the blood plasma, and this clotting factor cascade then stimulates the joining of little units of fibrinogen to form this insoluble protein of fibrin. And so it is then the protein fibrin which forms the clot, which will stop the loss of blood at a wound site. So those are the elements of blood. The heart is roughly a triangular structure about the size of our fist. As such, we can refer to a base and an apex. The apex then in about the 5th intercostal space, a couple inches to the left of the sternum. There are 2 types of chambers: atrium, which are close to the base, and ventricles, which then make up the majority of the heart. There are blood vessels, which we see on the surface of the heart, because the heart is muscle, just like the biceps requires a blood supply. The cardiac muscle of the heart requires a blood supply as well. To understand what we see on the inside of the heart, it's important then to recognize the way that blood must flow through the heart. So the heart is essentially a blood pump, and as such, there are chambers. The chambers are surrounded by the wall of the heart, which then includes the epicardium, this smooth outer surface, which helps to make part of the pericardium. And then the myocardium is the muscle in the wall of the heart. And then the endocardium is the smooth inner lining, so that blood can flow with a minimum of resistance. So to go any further, let's talk about how blood flows through the heart. Right now, there is blue blood, deoxygenated blood, which is in your brain, your hand, your foot. And your brain, your hand, your foot, they no longer want this blue deoxygenated blood. Now, the purple versus red colors here, they're a little bit exaggerated, but only a little bit. Hemoglobin does change its hue based on whether oxygen or carbon dioxide is bound. And so therefore, the blue blood that your heart no longer, or your body no longer wants, is then put into veins, and the veins fuse into larger and larger veins, small ones going into larger ones, until they then fuse to the vena cava, superior and inferior, or the coronary sinus, which empty into one chamber only. So while there are 4 chambers in the heart, one chamber, the right atrium, gets all of the deoxygenated blood. The right atrium then contracts and sends blood to the right ventricle. The right ventricle then pumps blood from the heart. Now, as it leaves the heart, this blood could go to the brain and back, to the foot and back, etc. But the brain, the hand, and the foot just got rid of this blood. They no longer want it. And so this blood must go to the one place where it can be converted into oxygenated blood. It must go to the lung. So the right ventricle pumps blood into this pulmonary trunk, which then splits into left and right pulmonary arteries, which sends blood to the lungs, the only place where gas exchange can occur. The carbon dioxide leaves, oxygen enters, and now this blood is oxygenated. This is the blood that the body parts want. So this blood then is shipped into pulmonary veins. Pulmonary veins return blood to the heart, but this red oxygenated blood enters the left atrium. The left atrium then goes, sends blood to the left ventricle, and then the left ventricle can pump this oxygenated blood into the arch of the aorta, from which it can go to the brain and back, to the hand and back, and to the foot and back. This is why the left ventricle has the thickest wall. It's sending blood to the brain and back, the foot and back, the hand and back, etc. It does the most work. So the left ventricle makes up the apex of the heart and has the thickest wall. The atria, which are simply sending blood to the ventricles just beneath them, they have the thinnest walls. And so knowing that helps with the identification of the various chambers of the blood. Now, this means then that there are these 2 circuits, so that the heart has a left and a right half. which are doing two different things. So the right ventricle, that's a pump of what's called the pulmonary circuit, where blood goes to the lungs and back. Notice that in the pulmonary circuit, the blood that is in the arteries is blue and deoxygenated, and the blood which comes back through pulmonary veins is red and oxygenated. Even though these are arteries, you don't have oxygen when you're going to the lungs. You only have oxygen when you're coming back from the lungs. And so in the pulmonary circuit, the right ventricle is the pump, and it is the arteries which carry the oxygenated blood. My fault. It is the pulmonary arteries which have the deoxygenated blood, and the pulmonary veins have the oxygenated blood. In contrast, the left ventricle, that is the pump of the systemic circuit. The systemic circuit sends oxygenated blood to systemic capillaries, and then in the systemic capillaries, the oxygen leaves and then becomes this blue deoxygenated blood, and that is what is returned to the body through the veins. And so the body has left and right right halves, which then send blood to the left and to the pulmonary and systemic circuits. So there are these two circuits. There is a pulmonary circuit. The right ventricle is the pump. There is a systemic circuit. The left ventricle is the pump. In the systemic circuit, it is the arteries which carry the red oxygenated blood. And then in the systemic capillaries, the oxygen leaves and the blood becomes deoxygenated, which then returns through these systemic veins. So the heart, with its left and right halves, then accomplishes those two tasks. The heart then also has valves, and these valves essentially serve to stop blood from going the wrong way, because in a cardiac cycle, then there are opportunities for blood to go in the opposite direction that it should. Blood simply moves according to changes in pressure. And so blood would go the wrong way given the opportunity. And so the heart has these essentially doors, these valves, which will stop blood from going the wrong way. Sorry for the delay in this video opening. There are two types of valves. The valves which separate an atrium from a ventricle. These are called AV valves. There's a right AV valve with 3 cusps, the tricuspid. There's a left AV valve, the bicuspid, with 2 cusps. And while blood is going the right way, they stay open. But if blood tries to go the wrong way, and there are moments in the cardiac cycle where it does attempt to go the wrong way, when that occurs, then the valves will close. So the AV valves can close to stop blood from going back into the atria, and the semilunar valves, which are at the base of the vessels. So there's a pulmonary semilunar valve at the base of the pulmonary trunk. There's an aortic semilunar valve at the base of the aorta. These close when blood is trying to come back into the ventricles. So the semilunar valves open when blood is going the right way, going from a ventricle into these vessels, and they close when blood attempts to go the wrong way and return into these ventricles.